Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after a short break. Our panelists for this session on Indo-China relations shall discuss the dynamics that continue to shape Asia's future. India and China are two of the most influential players shaping the geopolitical landscape of Asia. In this insightful session, our panelists will provide unique perspectives on China's strategic objectives regarding India and the broader global context. The discussions will explore both historical and contemporary dimensions of Indo-China relations, offering an in-depth look at the evolution of the relationship and future possibilities. I request Ambassador Shyam Saran to please come up on the stage. Please, sir. Ambassador Saran is a former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as Chairman of India's National Security Advisory Board. In 2015, he was the Telstra Distinguished International Fellow at the Lowy Institute. He is a career diplomat, having joined the Indian Foreign Services in 1970. He has served in several capitals of the world, including Beijing, Tokyo, and Geneva. He has been India's ambassador to Myanmar, Indonesia, and Nepal, and High Commissioner to Mauritius. In the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he headed the Economic Division and the Multilateral Economic Division, and also headed the East Asia Division, which handles relations with China and Japan. Subsequent to his retirement, Ambassador was appointed Prime Minister's Special Envoy for India-US civil nuclear issues, and later as Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on Climate Change. During his last two assignments, Ambassador Saran served as the Prime Minister's personal representative, or Sherpa, at the Glen Eagles and St. Petersburg G8 and G5 summits. He also attended the Pittsburgh G20 summit as a member of the Indian delegation. In 2011, Ambassador was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the President of India for his contribution to civil service. Also joining us is Ambassador Ashok Kantha. So may we have you on the stage, please. Ambassador Ashok is an honorary fellow and former director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, a distinguished fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi, and chair of the core group on China of the Confederation of Indian Industry. A career diplomat, he was Ambassador of India to China until January 2016. Prior to this, he was Secretary at Ministry of External Affairs. His previous assignments include High Commissioner to Sri Lanka, High Commissioner to Malaysia, Joint Secretary East Asia, Consul General in Hong Kong, Deputy Chief of Mission in Nepal, Director China MEA, and Director Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Earlier Ambassador served in different capacities at Indian missions in Singapore, China, and the USA, and at headquarters in New Delhi. In his diplomatic career spanning over 38 years, Ambassador specialized in India's neighborhood and extended neighborhood with a particular focus on China and South Asia. He has advanced certificate in Chinese language from National University of Singapore. To moderate this session, please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Dr. S.N. Narasimhan, Param Vishisht Seva Medal, Ati Vishisht Seva Medal and Bar, Vishisht Seva Medal. Lieutenant General Narasimhan is an infantry officer who served in the Indian Army for 40 years and worked extensively on the India-China border. He served as the defense attaché in the Embassy of India in China for 3 years. Excuse me. Prior to going to China, he qualified in the Chinese language with distinction. He has been an avid China watcher for the last 24 years. General is a former member of the National Security Advisory Board, and during his 3 tenures on the board, he worked on China and India's national security issues pertaining to defense. General was the first Director General, Center for Contemporary China Studies, a policy-oriented inter-ministerial think tank of Government of India, embedded in the Ministry of External Affairs for 5 years. He is presently an adjunct distinguished fellow with Gateway House, Mumbai, non-resident senior associate with CSIS, Washington, D.C., adjunct professor with National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, and emeritus resource faculty with Rashtriya Raksha University, India. He has done graduation in mathematics, post-graduation in defense studies, and PhD in India-China relations. Sir, can we have a group photograph before we start the session, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the graveyard shift, which is generally after the lunch and the food coma generally hits people. But I'm sure this panel will keep you awake and keep you interested in the subject. Two things before I open the floor for the initial remarks of Ambassador Shyam Saran and Ambassador Ashok Kant. One is I'm happy to see the NCC cadets. For your knowledge, I'm an NCC entry into the army. So I joined in 1976 after doing the Republic Day Parade and NCC C certificate. I'm a C certificate entry. So nice to see you guys. We didn't have an opportunity like this in those days. The second thing is one correction. We keep mentioning this word Indo-China. Please remember Indo-China is a different region by itself. It should be India-China wherever you mention. So particularly for the young people, please keep this distinction in mind. Even in the print we saw Indo-China, but that is not the correct way of saying this thing. That is the second aspect I want to have. Third, one question I have for the entire audience. How many of you have read Ambassador Shyam Saran's book? Okay. Right. For those who haven't read it, I would recommend that you read it. That is a book which is full of information, and he has linked the history of China to how it sees the world and India. So that is something which is a must read for everybody who wants to look at China in some form or the other. So that is just for the record, I read it once first, and when I was preparing for this, I read it again. So I read it twice.
And he told me that Ambassador Saran is sitting in the panel.
So I have to be careful about what I'm saying or what I'm not saying. So, in any case, nice to see you all here. Without spending much time, we are already running short of time. I would open the floor to Ambassador Shyam Saran for the initial remarks, and thereafter to Ambassador Ashok Kant. Then I'll come in and give a couple of points, and thereafter I'll open to the question and answer session for this particular audience. May I now request you to.
Thank you very much, General Narasimhan, and may I thank the Indian Military Heritage Festival for their very kind invitation to me to be part of this festival, and I'm very happy to also see that the organization which I currently head, the India International Center, is collaborating in the hosting of this festival. So we hope this relationship can continue in the future as well. General Narasimhan mentioned that he was part of the NCC before he entered the armed forces. I would also like to mention that I was also an NCC cadet when I was in school, but I was on the Naval Cadet Corps, and but unfortunately my experience in the NCC did not take me in the direction of the armed forces. I sort of got deflected into another direction. General Narasimhan also mentioned very kindly the book that I wrote a couple of years ago on India-China relations. The reason why I wrote this book was that, and I'm sure that my colleague Ashok as well as General Narasimhan will bear me out, that this is a country which is very important to India and perhaps will continue to be more important as we go forward. And therefore, I think it is extremely important that we should understand this country well. Whether it is as an adversary or whether it is as a challenger or a potential friend, unless you really have a good understanding of this country, it is difficult to really chart out a proper strategy to engage with China. The reason why I say this is that most of us, whether it is in the armed forces or whether it is in the foreign service, we are very much focused on the security aspect of our relationship, the political aspect of our relationship, sometimes also the economic aspect of our relationship. But my own experience has been that unless you understand the overall historical, cultural context within which that country operates, what is the prism through which it looks at the world? What is the prism through which it looks at India? And these are very much driven by its own history, by its own culture, by the temperaments of its people. And therefore, unless you understand that overall context, I think dealing with this country is going to be suboptimal in a sense. The second aspect that I wanted to mention was that in understanding a country, even if it is an adversary, it is extremely important to have empathy in dealing with that country. China is not a monolith. There are, I would say, as many Chinas as there are many Indias. There is a tremendous diversity which perhaps is not entirely seen clearly by us, of course not as diverse as India. So we need to have a more granular approach to China. And that can only come about if you have that sense of empathy. I mean, I may look upon China in my diplomatic career, I would have dealt with China mostly as an adversary, mostly as a threat and a challenge. But that did not prevent me from really appreciating what is a really remarkable culture, remarkable civilization, a civilization which is as old, perhaps older than our own. And there are many points of affinity between our two countries as well. So that's the other aspect that I would like to mention. Just a few concluding remarks that today we are at a very interesting inflection point in history because of what has happened in faraway United States of America. You have a Trump presidency, which is probably going to completely upend the world order as we know it. There is probably going to be a very different kind of a relationship between China and the United States of America. Some people will say that the level of adversarial kind of a relationship will rise, but Trump also thinks of himself as a deal maker, as a bargain maker, and will he be able to work out deals and bargains with China? Some of that he did during his last presidency. So we should not be too certain that there will only be a very, very competitive relationship. There may be points at which there may be, in fact, some degree of complicity even. And for India, collusion between China and the US is as bad as confrontation between China and the US. The best position I feel for us to be in is that our own relations with China should be somewhat better than China's relations with the US. That is what the space that we need to occupy if we want to optimize our own room for maneuver. We have recently had, after nearly 4 years of confrontation with China at the Eastern Ladakh, I'm sure General Narasimhan will have much more to say about it than I can. How important is it? I have no doubt that this is important to the extent that it has brought about some kind of a diminution in the tensions between the two sides. It is mostly welcome. But I do believe that we need to be cautious. We need to be somewhat, not be taken too much in by this. I have, in a recent article I wrote, that it is more a nudge rather than a shift. And I still continue to believe that is the case. There is much more which needs to be done. Why do I say that? You will recall that, we had two very unprecedented so-called informal summits between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi. It seemed as if they had a kind of a personal chemistry and a kind of a relationship which was perhaps unprecedented elsewhere in the world. They had spent nearly hours and hours together at both informal summits, which Xi Jinping had never done with any other leader. And therefore, a certain sense emerged in our country that, we have actually managed, because of the nature of our leadership, because of the fact that India was rising and rising very fast, that we had managed to somehow or the other, in general, manage the China threat. And yet, within a few months, you had what happened in Eastern Ladakh. So we have to be very careful, taking into account the experience of the past, that while we try to push this process of de-escalation, from disengagement to de-escalation, and hopefully a better understanding between the two countries. But I think it is very important for India, in terms of its relationship with China, to remain very, very cautious, very vigilant, so that we are not taken by surprise. I will stop there.
I will come on later. May I handle the floor to Ambassador Shokran, please.
Let me also begin by thanking USI, Indian Heritage Center, and other organizers for inviting me to participate in India Military Heritage Festival. Coincidentally, like General Narasimhan and Shyam, I was also part of NCC. Actually, at one point of time, my great ambition was to join National Defence Academy. Somehow that didn't happen, so I ended up in a different career. Ms. Shamshan has already, referred to importance of understanding the context of India-China relations, how China looks at India, looks at the world, and that's the theme of his book, which I'll also very strongly recommend. In fact, it's in my laptop, soft copy apart from the hard copy. I'll also endorse the point he made about the need for empathy, because sometimes we tend to become a bit too antagonistic or adversarial in our approach to China. That doesn't help in making correct assessment of the country. It also happens to be the largest neighbor. We should always bear that in mind. I will, essentially make 3 points here. One, what Shamshan referred to, the recent agreement on disengagement in Eastern Ladakh, which was announced on 21st October. And I agree with his assessment that it was more a nudge rather than shift. In fact, the process of renormalization of relations between India and China has barely begun. We should bear that in mind. There is no doubt greater stability along India-China borders, which is a welcome development. But as long as the borders remain abnormal, and borders are abnormal at this point of time, highly militarized, we cannot rush towards any full normalization relations with China. I think we should bear that in mind. Process of re-engagement with China started really with the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping in Kazan. But we are nowhere close to a reset in ties. My second point is that even when we look at what has happened in terms of disengagement of troops of India and China, disruption which was caused by China to status quo in Eastern Ladakh in the summer of 2020, there is an unfinished agenda, something which needs to be addressed. And this is something Chief Army Staff stated very clearly in fact, the lecture he gave at USI on 22nd October, when he mentioned the need to return to status quo before April 2020. We are nowhere close to that at this point of time. We should keep that in mind. And also that what happened in Eastern Ladakh sort of accelerated something which is already happening. That is the breakdown of paradigm that had governed relations between India and China, which was put in place in late 1980s. So we need to, that paradigm is behind us. So we need to find a new equilibrium in India-China relations, which is going to be a very difficult proposition. Third point is again something referred to by Ms. Shamsharan. We are at an inflection point in the sense that a world which is already in strategic churn, the element of uncertainty has become even sharper. People say that the only thing one can say with certainty about Donald Trump is that he's unpredictable. And in some respect, actually, he's quite predictable. But how we'll deal with China, we should start with any sort of fixed ideas. In fact, as Sharon mentioned, is quite capable of doing a deal with China, which can, keep us, find us on the wrong foot, which can blindside us. So there should be no complacency in India about, upcoming changes in global geopolitical situation. While it's a fact that today China is more vulnerable to deal with, say, a second round of enhanced tariffs that Donald Trump has been threatening, because economy is not doing well at all. We can discuss that later during Q&A if you like. On balance, I'll say that in fact we have, after a difficult period, a more strategic space vis-a-vis China. Because even though China is unlikely to sort of reduce its ambitions, it's looking for tactical adjustment with various countries. Started with the USA, Europe, Japan, and I think finally it's looking at some kind of tactical flexibility vis-a-vis India as well, without softening its position on our core interests, concerns and aspirations. So we should differentiate between the two, tactical shift and not sort of accommodating our concerns. These are 3 points. I'll very quickly sort of elaborate on the first point. We saw, 2 days ago, Additional Director General of Public Information of Indian Army put out a clarification debunking some of the recent media reports about new obstacles being raised in implementation of disengagement in Depsang Plains and Demchok. My expectation and hope is that a similar visibility will be given about nature disengagement which has been arrived at, which has been worked out, because at this point of time, at least I'm not very clear about what has been agreed. We know that the latest disengagement package was limited to Depsang Plains and Demchok. There again, we're not clear. In Demchok, for instance, whether we'll be going up to Chadingla or Nilunglala, Chadingnala junction, how far deep Chinese will be coming in both Depsang and Demchok. Will they be coming towards Putse? We don't know any of that at this point of time. Likewise, buffer zones. If Army Chief, what he said on 22nd October, if that's the objective, returning to status quo as before April 2022, then buffer zones don't make sense because they put a lot of restrictions on patrolling by India, on grazing by Indian graziers in Galban Valley, Hot Spring, Gogra, and north and south bank of Barkok Lake. So what happens to that? Are we going to sort of continue that process of negotiation? And then is there an element of quid pro quo? Credible media outlets like The Hindu and Economic Times have talked about the Chinese being allowed to do patrolling in Yangtze area or in Subansiri Valley, Asafila area. So if that's the understanding, I think we need to know about it because these will be serious concessions. Yangtze especially, we are aware that we were in a very strong position militarily. How in December 2022 we managed to foil their attempts to make inroads. And here a related point is that when we talk about the linking normalcy in relations with normalcy in borders, do we mean only disengagement or de-escalation and de-induction as well? And de-escalation and induction we can discuss going to very difficult processes. I'll conclude by just making 2 last points. One, that we should not lose sight of the fact that structural problems that bedeviled India-China relations predated Galwan. If anything, those problems become much more acute today, given the nature of the beast, the way China has been operating. In fact, the Narasimhan asked me to remind people that the Press Note 3, which imposed restrictions on FDI inflows from China, predated what happened in border areas. It was introduced on 17th April 2020 because of COVID, not because of borders. So there are problems which cannot be wished away. Those problems need to be addressed. And finally, today, as I mentioned, there might be some opening in terms of China showing a little bit more tactical flexibility, but any rushing towards normalization, towards business as usual, towards a reset in ties with China will be ill-advised because the challenge that China poses to us will remain the primary strategic challenge for us in our response in terms of enhanced deterrence, in terms of external balancing to the extent we can, in terms of improving our border infrastructure, in terms of reducing the capability gap with China. All that will remain as relevant today, if not more relevant. I'll conclude here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Before I do my own short remarks, I would like to pose one question to Ambassador Shamshan. I'll come back to you after I finish my remarks for that reply. In your book, you have elaborately talked about certain factors that the Chinese history has enabled China to shape its view of the world as well as India. I would like you to dwell on that a little more so that the audience can be very clear about it as to what aspects of that is actually bringing China to this kind of a worldview and the view about India. To Ambassador Kant, I'll ask one question. If you were to identify one red line and one green line in the way India-China relationships will go forward, what will that be? So I'll come back to both of these. When I started preparing for this, we had done some studies on how China views India. And China views India in different ways. Firstly, if you look at the Indian government, they feel that Indian government, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, has been extremely assertive. And their neighborhood first policy is actually a contestation of China's influence in India's neighborhood. And the rise of Hindu nationalism is being talked about in the Chinese media, as well as in certain academic kind of expressions that they do. And India's aspirations, they feel, when we say that India is ready to play a major role in the international system, they seem to question that by saying that it is an exaggerated self-perception. Exact word as I noticed it. So this is the way they look at the Indian government and the way India sees itself as far as the major role is concerned. In the international relations, the writings reveal and the media reports reveal that India seems to be trusting Russia more than US. Maybe it may be an effort to drive a wedge between India and US, that's a different issue. But this is what they seem to be writing. Then as far as India-Japan relations are concerned, a very interesting terminology came up. That is contrived proximity is what they talk about India-Japan relationship. And India-Iran relationship surprisingly has been looked at in a positive manner in the writings that we see in the Chinese writings. India's armed forces are another one that is getting discussed quite a bit, particularly after the 2020 Galwan incident. There are a number of expressions that they give for this armed force, India's armed forces. Firstly, they feel that the geography favors the Indian armed forces. Indian armed forces are battle experienced, and they have they keep conveying that the Indian armed forces are a problem, they are weak, etc. That's an intentional effort to deceive others. That is the kind of writing you get to see. As far as Air Force is concerned, they looked at Shakti, which happened in 2018 and beyond, and they feel that IAF is capable of organizing medium-sized campaigns anywhere that is capable of. And they also feel, for good measure, Rajiv, you should be happy. Pilots training in IAF is better is what they say, and we all know it. I mean, that is something. As far as the Indian Navy is concerned, they say it's a regional navy. It can control the Indian Ocean region, basically because of its geography, and it can block Malacca states by getting into Savannah, which the port that is getting created. This is the kind of feeling that they express in their writings. Indian armed forces have got a number of weaknesses. There are only positives that I told you, there are negatives that they talk about. They say less amphibious and airborne capability, shortage of ammunition. They picked it from the CAG report, surprisingly. CAG reports mentioned a period of time about ammunition holdings in India, and that they picked it up. Lack of infrastructure, submarines are weaker than the Chinese submarines, poor air defense, and weak domestic defense industry is something that they talk about, and weak electronic warfare capability. These are the kind of things that you get to see. On the economy, they feel that India has got the best performing stock market and good investment option, and investment for Chinese firms is something that they look at, and it's a good market. IT industry is strong. They don't have to tell us that, we know it ourselves. Demographic dividend is something that they talk about, and India can be rival to China in energy supply is something that they are mentioning. So these are certain positives. Negatives, they talk about industry. It has got outdated infrastructure, low-end manufacturing, unbalanced industrial development is that they talk about. And then, of course, land acquisition is a huge problem, is something that they mention. And agriculture is less modernized. Labor unions are an impediment, is something that they write. Because the way labor unions function in India and they function in China are entirely different. They're diametrically opposite, actually. So these are the kind of things that they talk about as far as India is concerned. As far as the world is concerned, I think Mr. Shamsharan's book clearly mentions it. They have a pluralistic view, but they feel that it will be a contested pluralism is something that they talk about. So that is something which the view is. But my own understanding is, while they talk of multipolar world, at a later stage, they are looking at a unipolar world with China being the unipole. We should not make that mistake. So at the moment, we are in a pluralistic state. It will ultimately go towards a bipolar, and thereafter then some kind of a unipole. And they visualize themselves to be that important power in the world. So this is the way I think they look at the world as well as India. Having said that, let me now turn back to Ambassador Saran for his response to the question.
Thank you very much, General Narasimhan. I think you have very cogently, put together the kind of perceptions that we sometimes see articulated by the Chinese side with respect to India. Let me just pick up on the point you made about multipolarity. So recently you would have seen the report on the Xi Jinping Prime Minister Modi meeting at Kazan, which Ashok also referred to. If you see the readout, is something is very clear that the Chinese readout said that both Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping agreed that the world is moving towards multipolarity, and that the emergence of the BRICS itself is a sign of that. The Indian readout says supports international multipolarity, but says that that international multipolarity must be based on multipolarity in Asia, which is missing from the Chinese readout. So you can see very clearly, while multipolarity may be considered, at least for the time being, as far as the world is concerned, in Asia there is no doubt in Chinese minds that this is a space which is to be dominated by China. So just to make that point. Now, as far as the larger picture is concerned, how has China's view of the world and India been influenced by its culture and history? So just take geography. So you have Chinese civilization, Chinese culture, Chinese economy developed essentially along the two very important river valleys, the Yangtze River Valley and the Yellow River Valley. This is the heart of the Chinese culture and civilization, where agriculture developed, where you had prosperous communities which came to occupy this space. And yet, on the entire northern and western periphery of China, you had these steppes, the prairies, which were dominated by pastoral tribes, very aggressive. About 50% of China's history is of attacks against the center heartland by these very aggressive tribes, whether they were Mongols or the Manchus or the Tibetans or the what later we came to know as the Kushans, but they knew as Yuezhi in Chinese texts. So this is throughout the whole span of about 3,000 years or so, right up to the beginning of the 20th century. This is the history of China. That there are periods of the center consolidating, becoming powerful, and there are periods when it is getting fragmented, when it's getting assaulted by these very aggressive tribes on the periphery. So what did this create in terms of the prism? That there was a very hostile periphery surrounding this very cultured and civilized center. The whole notion of the Middle Kingdom, for example, derives from this. But of course, we also know that there were occasions where actually this center was not only dominated, assaulted by these tribes, but empires were set up by them. So you had the Mongol Empire, which was known as the Yuan dynasty, or you had the Manchus, who actually were deposed only in 1912 or 1911. But they were Sinicized to some extent. They took on all the cultural attributes of the Han Chinese. So this is something which you have to keep in mind, that threat from the Chinese was seen always coming from the land frontiers, not from the sea. The sea was generally a benign. They never faced major attacks from the seaside. All the threat came from the landward side, and that's why you have the Great Wall of China, which didn't work very much, but it shows what was the sense of threat which they had. Secondly, this sense of being very culturally advanced, very highly civilized state was also something which led to a notion that this center of civilization was surrounded by concentric circles of less civilized, more and more barbarian, tribes and countries. So a very strong sense of hierarchy developed. That there is a certain pecking order that you must have, which is the powerful at the top, and you then have lesser ranks below. Not only in the family, not only in the community, not only in the country. So the whole Confucius orthodoxy is precisely this sense of hierarchy. So hierarchy in the Chinese sense is equal to harmony. If hierarchy is maintained and is observed, you will have harmony. If this disturbed, then there will be a disruption. There will be lack of peace, and whoever is bucking the trend in a sense, whoever is standing out, has to be put down. So this is the kind of schema, the mandala that the Chinese have. Cultural differences. And now let me come to India with just 2-3 examples. The very interesting thing is, if you take the language of Sanskrit. Now, Sanskrit began as an oral language. So in India, you would have Sanskrit, which could be written in the Brahmi script, it could be written in the Kharoshthi script, you could be written in the Siddham script, it could be written as it is today in the Devanagari script. So the scripts could be different, language was the same. Very strict, rules of how do you pronounce words, what is the rhythm through which you speak. Everything was focused very much on the oral side, on how does it sound. So if you were a Sanskrit scholar somewhere in the Indian subcontinent, in Indonesia, in Cambodia, or some Central Asian state, the language would be spoken exactly the same way. There would be no difference. But it could be written in different scripts. Chinese script is the same. So it developed with those characters, doesn't have an alphabet. It developed as a visual kind of a culture. Everything is written down. But while it was the same script, it could be pronounced differently in different parts of China. So, for example, when I was studying Chinese in Hong Kong, the language that was spoken in for example, Guangdong, the southern province, Cantonese, was completely different from what I was learning as Mandarin in the northern side. But if I wanted to make myself understood, I would just write it down on a piece of paper, show it, they would understand, and they would write down an answer on a piece of paper and give it to me. So this is a very, very important difference between the Indian culture and Chinese culture. Coming to the recent times. So when I was in China, we used to talk about the difference between our two countries. So there was a scholar of India who said, we Chinese are very puzzled by the fact that we had a lot of mutual sympathy with each other during your independence movement, during our struggle against Western imperialism. So you had Cotonese, you had the Congress sending a medical mission to Yan'an. So there was that element of sympathy. Somebody like Rabindranath Tagore was greatly admired, at least in some quarters in China. But look at how they saw India's independence compared to China's liberation in 1949. They said, how is it that you became independent on August 15, 1947, and yet your head of state for another year continued to be the British Governor General? How is this possible? How is it that the Indian Army, which was inherited by the independent state of India, was more or less the same army as before? What about the bureaucracy? The same ICS fellows continue to be the top bureaucrats in the Indian system. So how can you count this as freedom? Look at us. In 1949, it was a complete break for us from the past, from the feudal kind of a culture that we had. So, it is sometimes difficult to then explain to them why it is different in India. But their experience has been very different. So there are some of these sources of misperception, misunderstanding, that unless you really have a lot of engagement with one another, you will not be able to get away from these kind of prejudices. So I just thought I was.
Well, General Narasimhan has posed two questions to me. Where's the red line and where's the green line? Red line, sometimes people argue that China needs to show greater sensitivity to our interests in our shared periphery, South Asia, Indian Ocean region. But as it happens, China regards that part of the world, both land and maritime, as its strategic periphery. So it will be a little unrealistic on our part to expect that there will be absence of contestation. So that's a given, that will happen. So I will not regard that as a red line. For me, the red line today will be, China not continuing with its Operation Creep along the land borders of India. India and China had agreed that they will develop our relations while boundary question is not resolved. But that was predicated on a status quo, a line of actual control, not be disturbed. China is not interested in that. If we freeze the position that has emerged after this engagement package of 21st October 2024 and compare it with what obtained in early 2020, I am afraid that China would have made incremental gains. And this is what they have been trying to do in different theaters, so-called grey zone operations. Make incremental gains while staying under the threshold of outright military conflict. South China Sea is the best example of what they have done. So I think we have to be wary of that, especially if this package includes, certain patrolling rights for China and Yangtze and Asafila area. Coming to Green Line, I think one fundamental problem we have with China that it is not only not supportive of rise of India, but it has been sort of actively thwarting the rise of India, aspirations of India in so many different ways. I'll not go into specifics. So for me, Green Line will be China showing greater sensitivity to the fact that if there is rise of China, there is also rise of India. And they need to give space to us. But we fall into a peculiar problem here. Shamshan referred to China's own sort of historical narrative. In that narrative, China was the preeminent power during most of the recorded history. Largest economy, etc., etc. That may not be correct. There was an interregnum caused by century of humiliation. It would like to restore its rightful role as the leading power in the world. Multipolarity is a halfway house, something which will be overcome. And Xi Jinping has made it very clear. Look at his work report at 20th Party Congress. He talks about China wielding, being the most influential country in terms of comprehensive national strength and influence by the middle of the 20th century. But when it comes to Asia, as Ms. Shamshan rightly pointed out, this discrepancy in readouts of Indian Foreign Office and Chinese Foreign Office on meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. They're not making reference to multipolar Asia. We always argue that multipolar world is desirable, but multipolar Asia is equally necessary. Here again, we don't have common space, but that will be our green line. Expectation that they will be more willing to accommodate our concerns, interests, and aspirations, but are not very hopeful of that count.
Thank you. I'll just make 2 points and then open the floor for questions. One is about this, one aspect which actually comes prominently in Ambassador Shamshan's book is the concept of all under heaven. The Tianxia concept is something that he dwells very well in that book. And that is one of the things that is also shaping the mind of the Chinese when they look at India as well as the world. So that is one point I wanted to have. The second point is about the buffer zone, which Ambassador Kant mentioned. I think we need to be a little careful on making a mention of this word frequently. Basically, because what we agreed in 2022 when we decided to pull away from the four friction points at that point in time was temporary moratorium on petroleum. So that is what I think we need to keep emphasizing on. It's a temporary moratorium, and we should get back to the normal kind of petroling that we are doing in those areas is something that I think we need to keep in mind. With those 2 points, let me open the floor for questions now. Oh my God. Okay, sir, if it is okay with you both, 2 things. 1, keep your questions short. 2, address it to one person. And 3, don't ask too many. Yeah, let us take 2-3 questions together so that they can answer. Let me give it to the youngster first. Yeah. I'll come to you. On this side, there was raising of the hand, I'll just pass it.
My question is open to all three of you. It concerns the Brahmaputra damming project that has been in news. So, is there a situation in your opinion which might happen between India and China regarding the waters of Brahmaputra, as the project is being told, as it has been touted as something even greater than the three Gorges? How much threat does it pose to us?
Thank you. Next question, Rajiv. Give it there, I'll come to the next question.
Sir, I'm M. Marshall Sachdeva. A simple question, sir. You've been using this word normal relationship with China. Can any one of you define and quantify normal relationship? Okay, if this is done, the relationship is normal. Can that be done with China?
That's a good short question. Yes, please. Pardon me for not knowing your name, sir, please.
Thank you. Only one question. I think someone amongst you mentioned we trust Russia more than USA. My counter question is, can we trust USA? Thank you.
Ambassador Raghavan. There's some hand, I'll come.
The point was made that the experience of the past few years, even before Galwan, is that the arrangements which were reached in the 90s are no longer workable. Why is this so? Is it because the Chinese have changed? Or is it because the asymmetry between India and China has grown? And secondly, in your view, and this is to the panel, what would be the elements of a new arrangement which is more sustainable?
Okay. One last question, and I have to be partial to the NCC. I'll go behind, and then these 2 questions, and we'll wind up there.
Firstly, yes, sir, my name is Mansur Thakur. My question is.
Keep the mic closer, please.
My question is, recently what had happened in Palestine was some sort of blast of some communication devices, and that was mainly because of there was Israel involvement in that. What I see is that we are similarly dependent on China in some tech involvement in tech devices. So don't you think this poses a similar threat? Then the question is twofold. Firstly, is it true that we are highly dependent on China and this is the threat on us? Secondly, if it is not the case, then what is the case? And if this is the case, then what is the way forward?
Okay, last 2 questions, one here and one there.
This question is firstly, in the Ladakh sector, is it true that Chinese have come back to their 1959 trade line? Okay. And secondly, did we leverage fully the occupation of Kailash Range in our negotiations? General perception is that it was only done up from sector to sector negotiations and not for the entire eastern Ladakh sector. Thirdly, one more point, just brief. What is the impact on Siliguri corridor with Doklam, they are sitting on Doklam, and situation in Bangladesh which may fluctuate? What is the impact of this on the raise level of
Okay. Last question. No, this question and that's the end of it. We are running short of time. More than nothing, I have to concentrate at 5:35.
Railway. So I have a question regarding China's strategy. Why don't we have CEO Railway Board on it? We have the Cabinet Secretary, Defense Secretary, Home Secretary, the 3 Vice Chiefs and the Foreign Secretary of course.
CEO Railway Board.
Yes, to provide the logistical assistance.
All right, okay. Sir, I would go to you first. Whatever questions you want to answer, you take it up and answer. Similarly, Ambassador Khan.
So I had, what Ambassador Raghavan asked about why did the arrangements which were in place since the 1990s break down? Well, they started breaking down over a period of time, so it's not as if it happened suddenly. Perhaps this was the most serious of those problems, but these started even earlier. So we have had problems like this, which were in some way resolved also by the two sides. Why did they break down? One, those agreements, peace and tranquility agreements, had one very important assumption to really be able to work over a period of time, and that was the clarification of the line of control. Because unless you know where the line of control is, how do you judge whether or not there has been any kind of infractions? Although we began this exercise, the Chinese basically gave it up. And my sense is they gave it up because this gives them a, they can, if it is ambiguous, their ability to do what they like by claiming, no, this is not past the line of control. That becomes what they regard as a kind of leverage on their side. Secondly, my own sense is, and I think this is something which General Narasimha may be able to answer better. I did several border infrastructure surveys. I did one in 2004, another in 2007, and the last one in 2015, when I was chairman of the National Security Advisory Board. Now, what is very striking is that maybe we were complacent because of the peace and tranquility agreements in not really paying as much attention as we should have to the build-up of infrastructure on our side. So there were huge gaps. And 2004, when I went, it was frightening, the gaps that there were across the border. Now, that gave the Chinese a asymmetrical advantage because they were building up the infrastructure on that, whether it's the roads or whether the barracks that they had on their side. Roads were full metal roads sometimes, coming right up to the LAC, while in many cases, for example, in the eastern sector, we were 20 kilometers behind, sometimes even 50 kilometers behind. Your ability to supply, if there was a conflict, ability to supply quickly your posts near the border was very limited. So we went about starting to build up infrastructure on our side. So what happened? When we started building up infrastructure on our side, both in Ladakh as well as in the eastern sector, there were whole areas which we were either visiting very infrequently, our patrols, or they were not visiting at all because these were so remote and difficult to access. So what happens? The Chinese have been coming there quite regularly. Suddenly they find that there are many more Indian patrols which are coming. The encounters between the patrols become much more frequent than before. So the protocols which were in place start then breaking down. Now you might say, and this is what we would tell the Chinese, that you have been building up infrastructure on your side for so many years. If we try to build up infrastructure on our side, now you can't come to us and say, freeze it. That was in fact one of the proposals they made, that we should freeze border infrastructure development. That would have made us permanently, inferior in terms of our capabilities. So this is one of the reasons why it started breaking down. To my mind, I mean, I don't know whether this thing is correct, but my sense is that, particularly when I went on the survey in 2005, I could see that this was happening. So this is the other aspect. The third is you have to take the larger context in mind. And the larger context is that if you look at the Chinese stand on the India-China border since 1962, you will see that there has been a steady moving of goalposts. Okay, so up to 1982, Deng Xiaoping's famous statement, let us settle on the basis of as is where is, package proposal. That is, you keep what you have in the east and we will keep what we have in the west, and on that basis, let's solve this problem. Our response to that always was, no, this will mean that we are legitimizing your aggression in 1962. So it has to be LOC plus, LAC plus. There has to be something more. It cannot be on that basis. You come to 1985, and then in the borders talks, they change their position. They say, no. We cannot settle on the basis of the package proposal. Since the area of dispute is much larger in the eastern sector than in the western sector, in order to settle the border, you have to make meaningful concessions in the eastern sector, and we will make some corresponding unspecified concession in the western sector. Already changed. And then the next one, Tawang became the condition. They had not raised Tawang before. But in 1987, when we made Arunachal Pradesh state of India, then they said no border settlement is possible unless there is restitution of Tawang. So what you see is, if you take it in perspective, as the power balance between the two sides has gone increasingly in their favor, and they felt that they have much more leverage than before, their position has also hardened, and we are still in that position.
Well, there are quite a few questions. I'll respond very briefly. The question on Brahmaputra waters, what Chinese refer to as Yalung Tsangpo. Yes, I mean, Chinese are undertaking some projects. So far, they mainly run of the river project, so they don't affect the downstream flows into India, but they can, divert water. They can have, damming of water there. This is something which is monitored very closely by Government of India, but we don't have any agreement with China, which can, sort of prevent them from undertaking those activities as upper riparian. So it's an area of vulnerability for us, but at the same time, we have to bear in mind that Brahmaputra river on our side, actually most of the catchment area is on our side. So flows from China will affect, waters in Brahmaputra river only to a certain extent, not beyond that. So it's not that they can hold us to ransom. So we have to put things in perspective. Marshal Sachdeva's question. Marshal, in fact, we had come to the conclusion that our relations with China have been normalized, because the relationship had all attributes of normal state-to-state relations, normal people-to-people relations. We had dialogue mechanisms, bilaterally, multilaterally, globally. In terms of CBMs, I don't think any two countries has as many CBMs that we had between India and China to manage our borders. Trade was moving, investment flows happening. We had 25,000 Indian students. So we had come to the conclusion that yes, I mean, relations are normal with China. But then, what happened in Eastern Ladakh happened. And then we also made the linkage that as long as borders remain abnormal, we cannot have overall relations coming back to normal track. And that position, to my mind, remains unchanged. So it will take some time before we return to an erstwhile normalcy in relations. There is no, standard definition of normalcy, but one can understand what is normal, what is not normal. The fact that we have such a high level of military deployment in border areas clearly is not normal. So I think that needs to change, but de-induction will have to be, or a de-escalation will have to be done very carefully, because they have major advantages in terms of natural terrain, in terms of border infrastructure, in terms of time taken to induct and de-induct troops. We'll have to bear that in mind and move down the road of de-escalation and de-induction. Whether de-induction can be carried out at all I think that's another important question. Can we trust USA? You know, relations are not quite developed on basis of these concepts like trust. There is a convergence of interests between India and USA today, which is quite pronounced. There are differences also. It's not that we don't have differences, but in the larger business of seeking economic and technological transformation of India, we find USA to be an essential partner. To some extent, though to a limited extent, USA also helps in external balancing of China, especially given the fact that there is a big gap in military and economic capabilities of two countries. Raghavan's question, which Shyam has already addressed, I'll just add a couple of points there. You know, border question, which we had managed to sort of push to the not margins exactly, but not center stage of relationship, is back to the center stage. So, you know, the earlier paradigm based on developing normal relations, notwithstanding differences on boundary question, is a little more difficult to pursue now, especially when maintenance of peace and tranquility, respecting LAC, as Ms. Shyam mentioned, they're deliberately not interested in clarifying LAC. So border question is now very prominent in our relations. Then there are other issues like very different worldviews of India and China. How do we engage with USA? What will be our respective roles in Asia or Indo-Pacific? Nature of economic engagement in India and China, all that have become sort of problematic, contested territory. 1959 claim line is something we have never countenanced. 1959 claim line is a myth. This is something which was mentioned by Premier Chou En-lai in his letter to Prime Minister Nehru on 7th November 1959. It has never been defined in detail. Only time it has been shown on map was in a map appended to a letter Premier Chou En-lai sent to heads of state and government of Afro-Asian countries, very small scale map. It's a shifting goalpost. They keep changing it as they like to maintain ambiguity very deliberately. Finally, China Study Group, YCRB, Chairman Delbo Board is not part of it. Please understand, China Study Group, where earlier we never talked about it publicly, now it's being talked about, it's not meant for operational matters. Its domain is primarily to make certain assessments and give certain recommendations on issues relating to China, that too mainly on matters relating to land borders. Operational matters like how do we develop logistics for any say military operations involving China, those are matters dealt by military headquarters, services headquarters with relevant board. I don't think CSG has any role to play there.
Last, I think 2 or 3 questions have been left, but I'll try and answer those. One is the dependency on technology that you talked about. You're right. We are technologically dependent for many things on China, basically because it came cheap and so we bought them. Like, for example, CCTV cameras, your X-ray machines in the airports, many of them actually. So there is an effort now which is on to indigenize all those and then make them within the country. It is going to take some time. Till that time, we need to be patient and then we need to wait for that to happen. The question about new arrangements which Ambassador Raghavan asked, I for one believe that if all these arrangements that we have done, all the agreements we have signed, and all the SOPs that we have established have not worked in 2020, a new one may or may not work because both the sides have to follow it. So therefore, the answer should lie in probably tightening what we had already in place to ensure that such lapses are avoided. So that is the way I would like to see that. On the question about occupation of Kailash Range, please understand firstly, the occupation of Kailash Range actually achieved what it was meant for. It was meant for China to make sure that they vacate the areas that they have come into that it achieved. Second thing, the negotiations were for pre-April 2020 positions. If you want the Chinese to go to pre-April 2020 positions, how are you going to hold on to positions which you occupied later? That will not work. That will not hold water in any of the discussions. But it achieved the operational requirement that it was meant for. Siliguri corridor is a sensitive corridor. I commanded the division there, I commanded the brigade there. I also was deployed in IMTAT in Bhutan. I have seen both the sides of this entire thing. It is a vulnerable area, but I think we are aware of it and we have taken adequate precautions to ensure that this area is well protected. I leave it at that because the rest of the things are in the confidential domain. I don't want to talk about it. I think all that remains for me is to thank the esteemed panelists for their wonderful insights on the subject and thank you all for a good participatory effort in this particular.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.